Thank you. I'm thrilled to be here tonight with all of you, and I appreciate you coming out this evening. Now it's my turn to do all the things that you didn't come here for, which is, first of all, I'm going to be talking a little bit about all sorts of different ways to explore the island and get out on the landscape and learn more. And it's based on a new free mobile app that we launched last year, which is called What Happened Here, an Island History Adventure. And so it gets you out onto the landscape exploring. You don't have to do it in sequential order. You can just, if wherever you are on the island, you can pop up this app and it will tell you something that happened in that area. And so we're just encouraging people to look at the island through a different lens, using history as a way to understand the spaces that we have around us today. So that's what's inspired the talk. And there's a little rack card at the back that has the QR code and information if you want to download that. And then we also are a membership organization, and part of your membership supports these kinds of talks and being able to do these things for free. And then you get our annual publication called Chibako, and we have a few examples of the editions of Chibako in the back of the room as well. And all of our resources are free. So everything we do, all of our public programs, access to collections, everything except Chibako, are free and open to the public. We have a robust program schedule, again, also in the back. We really focus on being available in every town on the island, and so wherever you live, you should be able to find something taking place around you. Okay, so with that out of the way, I'm going to talk a little bit about the island's history and maybe some things that you didn't know tonight. And so, as you probably do know, each town on the island has its own historical society or its library that cares for and manages the history of its town. But MDI is 108 square miles, and our towns overlap in interesting ways. And so while each community is unique, we're still really interconnected. And MDI Historical Society is the only organization devoted to connecting those different stories from our communities to share a more complete picture of island history. And this island has an incredibly rich and diverse history. So rather than exploring one topic tonight together, I decided that I would base my talk on this mobile app and take us out onto the island in all sorts of different places. So my goal is to get you onto the landscape after you leave tonight, using a different lens to explore familiar places, but also hopefully you're going to learn something new that you can share with family and friends to be able to inspire them to do the same as well. So I have 3 short vignettes of island history that I'm going to start with, and then I'm going to take us through a little lightning round. So we're going to start with dairies. At its height, Mount Desert Island had almost 40 independent dairies operating throughout the different island communities, but they were mostly located sort of in the northern portion of the island, as you can see on this map, with the fertile areas known now, formerly as the Emery District, but where we know now the Stone Barn Farm is located in that area. The terrain of the island changes quite dramatically from its traditional like rocky ledge to more fertile farm areas in that part of the island. Not all these dairies had cows on their farms. Some of them bought milk from other producers to be able to process and distribute within their dairy farms. But the landscape of MDI during this dairy era looked dramatically different than it looks today. From the late 1800s up and through the 1960s, when milk was big business, before these small farms started folding, we had lots and lots of little tiny farms. And if you look for the evidence on the landscape today, you can still see the different woodlots, dairy barns, market gardens, farms. They're all a different assemblage, but the same types of buildings would have been present in each one of these small farms. So once you know how to look, you can still see evidence of these dairies. So milk as a product became increasingly popular in the late 1800s as women started to rely on it more to replace their feeding of infants as they started to leave the house more and work. It was marketed as safe and healthy to consume for children, and despite this, the fact that there were over a dozen milk-borne diseases that could be affecting children's health. Large urban dairy farms were often the source of these diseases and contamination, and they could happen at many stages during milk production. Cleanliness was vitally important, from the hands and udders that needed to be washed at all times, to bottles and cans that needed to be sterilized, but farmers also needed to control flies, dirt, and dust from getting into the milk as it moved from cow to bottle to truck to store. So at the same time that milk is becoming a primary product in most people's households, MDI was becoming a popular summer resort and a destination for summer residents in addition to more short-term people coming. Bar Harbor was the primary resort, obviously, on MDI, as we know, and the number of summer people who were staying in hotels was increasing rapidly. So locals started opening and expanding hotels and opportunities for people to stay, but they didn't always create the infrastructure that was needed to keep up with the waste and the water demands from this increased population. Sounds familiar today. So outbreaks were of particular concern during this window of time, and especially typhoid, influenza, and other respiratory diseases were common in resort communities, and an outbreak could make or break a resort, not just for one season, but permanently. So towns could get really bad reputations if they didn't act fast to prevent the spread of diseases or isolate diseases when they occurred. So there's this really fascinating study as I was doing this research from the Boston Medical and Surgical Journal from the fall of 1873 that focused on this forensic study of a typhoid outbreak that took place in Bar Harbor. And Dr. Morton was the chief medical examiner who created the illustration that you see on the screen. That was part of his report. And this outbreak grew quickly, and it was part of eventually 13 people ended up contracting typhoid as a result of this outbreak, several of whom died. Dr. Morton noted that Bar Harbor grew from, quote, no more than half a dozen houses to a dozen hotels and summer houses that could accommodate between 2,000 and 3,000 people. We have in this instance repeated at Bar Harbor an experience common to many growing villages where sanitary precautions have failed to keep pace with increased population. Dr. Morton claimed that the local owners and townspeople had, quote, limited means and contracted ideas that have precluded the requirements of a civilized township than those primary ones of food and shelter. As a consequence, the primary means of disposal for the excreta and kitchen washings of half a dozen cottages are still applied to the crowded summer village. So this became an issue in August of 1873 when this typhoid outbreak took place at the Bayview Hotel located in Bar Harbor, not the current Bayview Hotel. A cesspool was located on the seaside of the hotel, and a drain pipe connected the cesspool to the kitchen, which is the illustration here. So as those ocean breezes came in the afternoon, it blew across the stagnant water of the cesspool and up the drain pipe and into the rooms surrounding the kitchen on the bottom and this corner of the hotel. And it wafted into open windows, and it spread the disease in a matter of days. Simultaneously, while this was taking place, there were also outbreaks of scarlet fever at the nearby Roddick House and Atlantic Hotel. It was a matter of 2 weeks that summer visitors packed up and left, and Bar Harbor's season ended prematurely. So to save their hotels and the community, residents quickly banded together to form the Bar Harbor Water Company. And only 65 days after breaking ground, new pipes carried clean water to Eden from Eagle Lake for the 1874 season. Local hoteliers further mobilized and expanded their establishments in the 1870s to the 1890s, inspiring thousands of people to return to the summer resort each year. So increasing crowds meant increasing food supplies were necessary, both from local farmers but also to be shipped in. But milk, as an important supplement to the diet, had to be sourced locally. We didn't have the refrigeration shipping technology to be able to bring it in outside of local sources. So combating the risk of disease was one of the main purposes of the formation of village improvement societies or village improvement associations. And they began to form on each island town starting in the late 1880s, 1890s. And they were comprised primarily of summer residents and influential locals, and the VIAs met to plan and invest in their communities, so including like recreation, beautification, but they also had sanitary committees. And in each of those sanitary committees, they had a milk committee as a subcommittee of the sanitary committee. So the purpose of these committees was to build awareness about the importance of cleanliness and to educate farmers about the ways to improve sanitation on their farms. And Bar Harbor, all these were voluntary until 1906. Bar Harbor was the first to actually hire and pay for a milk inspector. And okay, so all of their milk inspector reports are actually digitized. You can find these, the Bar Harbor Village Improvement Association has digitized most of their reports. And they have all the members who were on the committees, as well as the reports themselves. And then they are also publishing bacterial counts from all the different farms. And this is really interesting because this is like such an interesting example of local control, because this is all being done at the behest of like residents. This is not state, municipal, or federal law or policy. This is all being done based on essentially pressure, public pressure. So in 1906, the Bar Harbor Milks Committee inspector reported in his first report, quote, "Investigations made by the chairman of this committee reveal a state of affairs in the dairies supplying the town that is, to say the least, astonishingly lax. The dairymen are willing to conform to suitable regulations as to tests of cattle, et cetera, provided that they're able to secure a return for the increased expenditure involved. Unless consumers are willing, as they have thus far failed to show, to pay for the greater cost of certified milk, it will not be forthcoming." The Bar Harbor VIA began adding a milk report in their annual reports starting in 1911, when it documented a request for funds to collect and test samples of milks from 14 different dairies, noting, quote, "Chemically, all milk samples examined were excellent, yet the report goes on to offer some areas for improvement. Your committee is of the opinion that the farmers supplying the milk for Bar Harbor are intelligent and willing to do what is within their power to meet the suggestions. While the number of bacteria in most of the milk examined is excessive, it's certain that a few improvements, if adopted by the farmers, will reduce the bacteria content to within a reasonable limit. The chief faults identified at the time were dark, unventilated, unwhitewashed, and unscreened cow barns, bacteriologically uncleaned utensils, bottles, due to lack of milk rooms used solely for bottling or refrigerating, lack of information on the part of the farmers as what's required, and lack of interest on the part of consumers. Despite the fact that island dairies were producing clean milk, and never do we have a record of a case of an island dairy producing contaminated milk or causing an outbreak, overall concern for public health and fears of outbreak in other parts of the country brought those fears and implementing management to local suppliers to the island. Dr. Robert Abbey, founder of the Abbey Museum, was a local physician and summer resident, and he convened several sanitation forums starting in 1915, bringing doctors from all across the eastern seaboard to Bar Harbor. And he says, quote, "The means of efficiently handling special problems of resorts in relating to milk supplies, there's no valid excuse for epidemics because of Pasteur's work conquering them and making sanitary conditions possible. However, it would take 15 years before pasteurization reached MDI." Frustrated by oversight from milk committees, low prices, and the boom and bust cycle of seasonal markets, in 1932, farmers on MDI banded together to form the MDI Dairies, the first milk collective on the island, or cooperative. They offered pasteurization, delivery, raw milk, and more products like sour cream and butter and ice cream. Now, each farmer no longer had to purchase their own equipment. They could sell their milk to the cooperative, where it would be mixed in with other suppliers, processed and delivered. They had a series of trucks that delivered to residents all over the island 7 days a week. Given the continued demand for raw milk in Seal Harbor specifically, the cooperative offered that as well. And for MDI dairies, this, for a while, was a viable solution to the boom and bust cycle and challenges that seasonality was creating for the dairies. And they were prevalent in that area of Eden and Mount Desert through the 1950s. But by the late 1970s, the day of the small dairy was coming to an end, due in large part to large chain grocery stores, which were purchasing large quantities of milk and selling it at a low price. And so local small dairies could not keep up with that level of demand and also of the low prices. The last dairy plant on MDI was Clark's Dairy in Southwest Harbor, which was a bottling and distribution center. They never actually had cows or milked cows there. In 1980, Clark sold their business to the Hancock County Creamery in Ellsworth, and the plant became MDI Springwater. And that used to be a dairy. All right, so that was our second story is about development of the island. So colonization of the island by year-round European settlers started in Soamesville in the mid-1700s, and not long after, land on the island was starting to be allotted for development, and plans were designed for communities that were marketed to potential settlers to come up and be able to settle land on the island. Governor Bernard was granted a large tract of land on the western half of MDI in 1762 in lieu of cash payments for services that he rendered to the Massachusetts Bay Colony. He came to MDI with a group of surveyors to lay a baseline for a town in Southwest Harbor. So this is what his town was going to look like. You can picture Southwest Harbor, the head of the harbor now. There's a large field and you look out literally right down the harbor. This goes to either side of it. Harbor's here and this will go up the hill. There, this is his map. So his plan, this is for 100 family lots. And they had roads, a meeting house, a church, a school, and common community grounds. He determined that all the lots would face the bay and that each settler would receive 5 acres in town and then 15 acres outside of town to be able to have livestock, in addition to 5 acres of salt meadows. However, at the time, MDI was still within the province of Nova Scotia, and years of legal battle over territory between Nova Scotia, Britain, and Massachusetts prevented people from buying into this settlement that he had planned. And by 1767, political unrest in Boston and a lingering disagreement between Bernard and the Massachusetts Bay Assembly lost Bernard title to these lands. So no settlers ever came and settled into Bernard's dream, and you can go to Southwest Harbor and see it's not there. There's a similar story that happened to the eastern side of the island, which was granted to Therese de Gorgoire, and she also had a settlement plan that was never built or developed. But there are a lot more settlement plans that were made after that we don't see very often. But if you look at historic maps, you can actually see them quite clearly in several of the historic maps where they were planning large communities. Most of us on the island are familiar with our sort of creation stories. The artists first arrive in the 1840s and they paint the island, and it's so beautiful as they take these beautiful rugged landscapes and they share them outside, and people start coming to the island in the 1850s. Those people are initially staying in the houses of private residents. But then that quickly starts to change as we see transitions from people wanting to stay in local hotels and then eventually wanting their own houses to be able to stay in either year-round or for the summer. And we see the rise of the summer cottages. That's a story we're well familiar with. But it may surprise you how many of these subdivisions were actually planned all over the island. So this map is one for a proposal that was here in Northeast Harbor in the 1930s. And this shows the lands of Lauren Kimball subdivided into 24 lots that would have been on the corner of Manchester and neighborhood roads. The lots were subdivided and they were deed restrictions placed on them, but the Great Depression put an end to this development before it ever was able to be built. There was also a large development planned on Indian Point called Highland Falls, where Deep Cove is now, and this had dozens of private summer homes, a large hotel, a ferry terminal that would bring passengers into Deep Cove to be able to stay there. There was Intervale Park, which was planned for 50 units of subdivisions in Hulls Cove. And at Otter Creek, there was another subdivision of 20 lots that were planned along Otter Creek Point, looking back towards Sand Beach. While MDI was the focus of most of the tourism that came into this region, there were hotels and cottages that were flourishing as a result, but real estate agents and investors were marketing beyond MDI itself and looking at the region as ideal for growth. Huge hotels offered visitors fine dining, beautiful views, tennis and golf, and opportunities for networking or romance. And these were experiences that would be available in any summer resort. However, MDI offered something really different. Culturally, the strict social rules that dominated Victorian life were much less restrictive here than in, for example, Newport, Rhode Island, or other resorts. So couples or small groups of people could take canoe rides, go hiking, have picnics, and all of those allowed for a more relaxed experience together and a chance to mix with the opposite gender, which would not normally have happened, and to find remote places to escape the eyes of your chaperone. Bar Harbor became known as the place for summer romances. So much so that an entire genre of romance novel called the Bar Harbor Romance became popular nationally and was written even by authors who were never in Bar Harbor. The island was also a place for adventure. People, especially women, had more freedom here. They could hike, bike, explore, sail, canoe, and race, especially against men, presenting opportunities to show their strength, their independence, and their intelligence in ways that they couldn't do in other spaces. So because these were had more loose social barriers here, then there were also other barriers that were broken down, not just between genders, but also between class. And wealthy residents often made really close and personal friendships with year-round residents, some which continue through generations to this day. So this seemed like an ideal setting to build a new kind of resort. On the mainland in Sorrento, wealthy African-American investment firm Nail and Parker pulled together a syndicate of investors to purchase a land on the water in Sorrento. This had previously been planned as a resort, and they had done some of the initial infrastructure, and then infighting among the family bankrupted it, and it went to just, I don't think it was auction, but to some sort of sale. And Nail's group was able to purchase the rights to the land. John Nail had made his fortune in the Harlem Renaissance, and he was part owner of a record company, in addition to being a leader in the NAACP and in the early civil rights movement. Nail and his investors envisioned an upscale resort for wealthy African Americans overlooking MDI, with public support from prominent Black actors, musicians, and boxer Harry Wills. W.E.B. Du Bois was an early and vocal supporter. Having visited MDI previously, he encouraged Black families to buy lots in this resort so they could, quote, be part of one of the finest summer settlements in the United States of America. Despite the fact that the resort was planned at the height of KKK activity in Maine, the papers reported that MDI residents were not concerned with the establishment of an African American resort in Sorrento. However, Maine was not hospitable to African Americans at this time, where they faced discriminatory lending conditions, covenants limiting land ownership to white residents only, and many Maine towns were known as sundown towns, where Black people had to leave town by sundown or face violent consequences, or at least be denied basic amenities like food and shelter. Sorrento was too far from Boston or the Massachusetts border to drive up in one day in a car for the 1920s. So Black families wanting to make the trip had to make careful plans on where to buy food and gas, where to stay, and they had to have a plan in place to keep them safe if their car broke down. Several factors prevented this resort from opening, including the Great Depression, financial obstacles aimed at preventing Black ownership, and the geographic isolation of down East Maine. However, the greatest challenge to its success was most likely Jim Crow laws in America at the time. So it never happened. And the last little vignette I'm going to share is about a project that we have been working on at the Historical Society since 2020 called Landscape of Change. And this is about the unique ecological conditions of MDI and efforts to understand and protect it that have led to a strong culture of science on the island that remains to this day. So I love this fact, it's so surprising to me. I'm from California, but MDI has the same number of climate gradients on our 108 square miles as the entire state of California, which is fascinating. So it makes it this ideal microcosm for study because you can get between these really extreme environments in a very short amount of time, and it makes it really easy to observe and to study change over time. So our story starts with the Champlain Society, that group of students from Harvard that many of you are probably familiar with. Founded by Charles and Sam Eliot, the first group came here in 1880 and camped on a small field at Westcott Cove, which that field is actually still open. It looks to the west across the Sound at Flying Mountain. So if you are driving along Sargent towards Manchester, there's a little opening there, and that's where they camped. In 1882, they moved their camp to Northeast Harbor on the fields below where the Astaku is now. And they spent a decade documenting MDI's climate and ecology, recording everything in daily logbooks, which are in the collection of the MDI Historical Society, and they're also digitized. One of their members wrote the first catalog of island plants. Their weather records have contributed to our state's understanding of climate, and their observations of birds and pollinators are guiding scientists as a benchmark upon which to measure changes in population dynamics today. As members of the Champlain Society explored MDI, they became increasingly alarmed at the extensive logging that was taking place here. The invention of the portable sawmill in the early 1880s allowed for timber to be cut in more locations than ever before, and by 1890, most of MDI was clear-cut. Charles Eliot and Edward Rand wrote in the logbooks every day that something should be done to preserve what little forest was left at the time, and to purchase logged land at a low price and restore it for the benefit of people and nature. The idea was lost as the students graduated and they moved on to different careers in their lives. They were just left in the logbooks. Charles Eliot became a landscape architect working for Frederick Law Olmsted, and he helped design Boston's series of parks known as the Emerald Necklace. He traveled in Europe and was inspired by public gardens there and continued to contemplate how to bring that model of public land access to MDI. Suddenly, he died at the age of 37, and his father, Charles W. Eliot, was going through his son's papers and found these musings that his son was continuing to think about and that the students had written in the 1880s. And he approached George B. Dorr about how to make his son's dream a reality. And that, of course, as we say, is history. But is it? Because today, the MDI Historical Society is leading a collaboration of an effort to use these historical records, like the logbooks, to help scientists, teachers, and the public measure the scope, scale, and speed of climate change on MDI. This collaborative effort has won national leadership awards and has been featured as a model in books, blog posts, and conference sessions. Since we launched the project, over 15 organizational partners have taken part in research, communication, community involvement, and planning, from our lead partners at the Skutik Institute and Gulf of Maine Research Institute to artists like Jennifer Steen-Boer, Maine Coast Heritage Trust, MDI Biological Laboratory, all MDI schools, sustainability committees from each town, and more. Landscape of Change is an ongoing project that engages our community in measuring and understanding how climate change is impacting MDI, because change is happening faster here than it is anywhere else in the state. So if you think of that climate gradation example that I gave earlier, because we're so small and because those gradients are so precise, change is happening faster and it can be measured more accurately than it can in other spaces in the state. So using historical records in our archives and others, we can extend the data sets that scientists are using to be able to measure change over time. So this not only helps improve the information that we have accessible to us today, it also increases the accuracy of climate prediction models that we look towards for planning in the future. So historical records have helped us understand changes in bird populations by layering historical observations with modern citizen science observations recorded on iNaturalist and eBird. So for example, we have learned that boreal species are moving further north and temperate species are moving into those ecosystems. So when I first moved here, we never saw cardinals in the winter 20 years ago, and now cardinals are here all winter long. Turkeys, turkeys all the time, you never used to see turkeys. That was an introduced species, but they're moving into these ecosystems, whereas boreal chickadees and others are moving out. So we see them less and less. And we can understand what that looks like based on these historic records. And then we can also benchmark changes against measurements published by the state related to climate change. So how are changes in precipitation, temperature, and shoulder seasons changing on MDI? We're happening at the same rate of change, but we're happening at a larger scale of change here. So we're outpacing change among the rest of the state. And if you think about where we're located in the Gulf of Maine, it's the fastest warming body of seawater in the world, and we are on this boreal and temperate zone, the transition zone. It means that our change can happen very quickly because we have such sensitive ecosystems. So I am not a climate scientist, I am a historian, and so I'm trained in interpretation and museum work. And so bringing the skills of interpretation that the museum staff have, artists like Jennifer Steen-Boer, and other education partners, we can take the complicated science of climate change and really start to make it accessible to wider audiences and facilitate conversations about change, risk, opportunities, and resiliency. So to do this work, we focus on pressures that are facing the island. So we listen to our community and what's happening around us, and we find those opportunities to bring forth historical resources to engage the community. And so we focus this collaborative efforts. They're constantly shifting every year. We try to change our focus. But for the past 2 years, we focused on sea level rise, for anyone who was here in the winter of '24, for obvious reasons. And so we've been looking through the archives at historic records for past storm tides and regular, just tide records, but also extreme tides and other weather event tides. And then we map those observations against measurements taken today. And so we have this interactive map. You can actually participate in this. If you have a place that you love along the water and you take consistent photos, you can download them to this anecdata map. You can let me know, I can give you the link. And then this is a constantly live updating map. So we're layering historic photos and historic measurements with observations taken today. And students at the high school have actually been helping build this map with Gulf of Maine Research Institute and SCUDIC and our partnership. And so what's really great is we're able to test what the predictions are against what we see on the ground. So Gulf of Maine Research Institute predicts sea level rise initially in a bathtub model, which of course the underwater topography is not a bathtub. And so what they say we'll see flooding, increased flooding, predictively needs to be ground tested and observed during actual flooding events. And so for one example, we work with the Oceanarium on Route 3 heading out of town on the other side of the island. And GMRI's predictive model indicated that they would not have flooding within their parking lots during king tide, like seasonally high tide events. Well, that's not true. We documented a lot of those. And then in the storms in 2024, we actually, they had 18 inches of stormwater pushed up into their site. And so this is the little sign that says 2050. This is part of our collaborative effort to show where rising water is headed. And so that's at the Oceanarium's lot during a king tide event, not a storm tide. And then you can see in the bottom corner here, we have a group of high school students. We take them out on the landscape and we train them how to measure. So you'll see a lot of communities, they'll have like sea level rise gauges of where things are going, which is interesting. But our goal is to actually empower you to go out onto the landscape and measure that for yourself. If you have a place you're interested in or you're concerned about, we have the tools for you to go out and learn how to measure to say, like, what's the tide going to be like in 2050 or 2100? And so we're trying to take all this information and empower our communities so that we can understand our threats and our challenges together. Okay, that was our deep dives. Now it's the lightning round, my favorite. Southwest Harbor gained a reputation for smuggling and unruly defiance of custom laws in the late 1700s, and they were added again in 1814 when Southwest Harbor residents took part in the only battle of the War of 1812 that took place on MDI. The HMS Tenedos was a 38-gun frigate with 284 sailors, and it was skulking around Frenchman's Bay, stealing boats, stealing food, scuttling other boats, and interrupting trade routes in general. The ship anchored off of Norwood Cove, and several rowboats were launched to capture schooners that were in the harbor. But Southwest Harbor residents formed a local militia, and after exchanging fire, they killed 3 British sailors and wounded 1. It is still a point of pride for Southwest Harbor locals. According to tide records, the sea around MDI has risen 8 inches since 1950 and is predicted to rise another 18 inches by 2050. In 1903, a local ordinance allowed each town on MDI to determine whether or not they were going to allow cars. The 3 towns of MDI at the time, Southwest Harbor was part of Tremont, were Eden and Mount Desert and Tremont. Eden and Mount Desert said no cars. Tremont said yes cars. If you look at this map, like a challenge there, is Tremont's in the pink down here. Access to the island is through Eden. So began a 12-year battle over whether to allow cars on MDI, which pitted summer residents against who wanted to protect their peaceful island resort against locals who wanted to have opportunities and the status afforded by automobiles. But summer residents can't vote, so they had to influence locals to vote their cause. So they often used fear tactics and threats, like cars would cause injury to children and chickens. Chickens are in every single thing they talk about cars. Like, they're like more sacred than children. We have this great postcard that this postcard here, Toot and Be Darned, was a national postcard all over the country, but someone has mounted it to this little board and sent it to different residents saying this is an object lesson for automobile enthusiasts on Mount Desert Island. This is bad enough, but what would happen if the team were going in the other direction? Also, you'd have increased taxes. So they're using lots of ways to scare people to vote their causes. So you need increased taxes to widen the roads, and if the summer residents decide not to come here because there's cars and they don't like it, then it would result in economic disaster for the island locals. Bar Harbor lifted the ban in 1909, and Mount Desert was forced to lift the ban in 1915 when the state legislature voted that all towns had to allow automobiles. Maine had the largest population of KKK in the 1920s outside of the American South. and several crosses were burned on the island and at a rally where 4,000 Klan members in Trenton were celebrating the election of their candidate for governor, Percival Baxter. Crosses were burned here in Northeast Harbor on the lawn of what was formerly the neighborhood house, not the current neighborhood. Wabanaki people traveled to MDI prior to European contact and only started the tradition, year-round prior to European contact, and only started the tradition of coming in the summer months in the 1880s to the 1920s so they could sell handmade items and excursions to rusticators. Today, there are 4 federally recognized tribes living in Maine on 5 different reservations. In 1896, Anne and Joseph Thorpe built Ravensthorpe on Greening Island, where he had a 9-hole golf course. Thorpe later helped establish the Northeast Harbor Golf Course on Corson's farm. Starting as a 9-hole course, the hazards included Corson's cows. At the height of the early 1900s, Hall Quarry employed over 1,000 granite workers to split, carve, move, and ship MDI's iconic pink granite. The wharf where John Williams' boatyard is now could once accommodate up to 10 3-masted schooners at one time, taking on pavers and large blocks of stone. Perhaps you've seen in the news lately, there's a shipwreck just off, I think they've revealed the location, but I will anyway, off of this area in the Sound that is in dispute with the state and a private group that's trying to take the pavers off this shipwreck. We have the story in our archives that was recorded, and I'll just read it here quickly. Quote, in early spring 1898, a big old 2-master called the Delphini had just taken on a load of granite and was heading down the Sound. A 3-master was going out at the same time, and both skippers suddenly sighted a huge cake of sea ice on which had come down from the mountain. According to oral history, upon seeing the ice right in the path of the Delphini, the other skipper shouted, "You're not going to butt into that, are you?" Well, I don't know what was in the mind of the Delphini skipper, but he shouted back, "I'm going to let her go." And that was the end of his ship. There was an awful crunch, and the ice just stove in that old boat right at the loading porthole close to the waterline. Down she went in a couple minutes and only 25 feet from shore. For over 40 years, the tips of the masts could be seen at low tide. During World War II, the Coast Guard decided that they were a menace and snipped them off. Divers have found the wreck of the Delphini, and they're trying to salvage the pavers, but the state has stepped in and claimed it's an archaeological site, and of course, a court case. Over a century ago, George Dorr donated land to establish both the MDI Biological Laboratory and Jackson Laboratories on MDI with the express goal of connecting scientists with the patrons who would support their work. Before becoming editor of the Bar Harbor Times in the 1960s, LaRue Spiker was accused of being a communist and tried and convicted for treason during the McCarthy era. One of the top 10 weirdest weather events in US history happened in Bar Harbor in 1853, known as the Purple Fire Snowstorm. It rained 20 minutes of terror on the people of Bar Harbor as ball lightning came in through windows, doors, down chimneys, tore up the ground, uprooted trees, and destroyed ships in the harbor. I have another talk that I love giving called Wicked Pissa. We go into the details of the Purple Fire Snowstorm of 1853. The spy, James Bond, was named for the ornithologist of the famous book Birds of the West Indies, James Bond. The real James Bond spent summers on MDI and helped Carroll Sargent Tyson collect specimens for his series of paintings that are said to rival Audubon's. The collection can be seen here in the Northeast Harbor Library. During Hurricane Daisy in 1962, the waves at Mount Desert Rock were so high they crested at 80 feet, the height of the glass room at the top of the tower of the lighthouse, where the terrified lighthouse keepers were riding out the storm. Wave crashed over the entire island, which raises 25 feet above the shore, and the tower is 70 feet above that. Built of large blocks of Maine granite, they were stuck in the tower for 3 days after the storm. And finally, because we're all probably ready for some food, I'm going to end on a few quick food facts. Julia Child had 13 ways to cook lobster in her Art of French Cooking. The only way she never cooked it was in a microwave. Oysters were commonly enjoyed by the ancestors of modern-day Wabanaki over 9,000 years ago, but as Frenchman Bay got deeper and colder, oysters could no longer live here. As the Gulf of Maine is warming, this is part of the reason that we have mussels disappearing, but oyster spawns from local aquafarms are establishing wild populations in the warming shores around the island. And finally, despite common belief that prisoners and indentured servants were limited to eating lobster only twice a week, any more would be considered cruel and unusual punishment. According to Yale professor and food historian Paul Friedman, there is no record of this being true. Happy to take any questions or comments.